The pressure begins. The night was quiet in Mountain View, California. The streets were nearly empty, with only the soft hum of cars in the distance and the faint glow of street lamps guiding late walkers home. Inside a modest but warm house, Sundar, Pichai sat in silence, looking at the faint reflection of himself on the glass of the sliding door. The day had been long, meetings with engineers, long discussions with product teams, and a constant stream of emails had left him mentally tired, but not restless. Sundar was used to such days. What he was not used to was the sudden vibration of his phone at such a late hour. It was nearly midnight, and he usually kept this time for himself, away from all corporate noise. He glanced at the phone, expecting a routine message or perhaps a family call from India. Instead, the screen showed something he had never expected, a direct call from Washington. The name that flashed sent a sharp current through his veins. It was not just a diplomat. It was one of Trump's closest advisors. Sundar hesitated for a second, his fingers tight around the phone. He already felt in his heart that this was not going to be a normal conversation. When he answered, the voice on the other end was brisk, almost forceful. There was no greeting, no warmth, no attempt to ease into the subject. "We need you, Sundar. The president believes you are the key to making India bend." The word struck him cold. Bend? The thought twisted inside him like a knot. He had worked his entire life to show that respect was not weakness, that humility was not surrender. But here he was, suddenly caught in the crossfire of two nations, expected to play a role he had never asked for. The call went on, filled with demands that sounded less like requests and more like orders. Sundar listened quietly, but his mind was racing. Every sentence felt heavier than the last, every pause a reminder that he was being dragged into something far larger than himself. He was no longer just the CEO of a global company. He was being pulled into a political storm that had the power to change the balance between two of the world's biggest democracies. As the call ended, Sundar sat frozen, staring at his phone in disbelief. The silence of the room felt louder than any voice. He thought of his journey from a small house in Chennai, the smell of coal from his father's job, the nights when electricity was uncertain, and the quiet dreams he carried as a boy. He thought of how far he had come, and how every step was guided by humility, by patience, by resilience. And now, all of that seemed to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. The next morning, Sundar carried the weight of the call like a stone, pressing on his chest. He walked into the Google campus with his usual calm smile, but behind that calm was a storm no one could see. Employees waved, smiled, shared updates, but Sundar heard none of it clearly. His mind kept replaying the sharp tone of the advisor, the expectation that he would use his position to pressure his homeland. It was not just unfair, it was deeply personal. That evening, as the sun shifted to gold and orange, Sundar received another call. This time, it was not from Washington, it was from New Delhi. The voice on the other end was steady, calm, and familiar. Dr. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, had heard whispers of what was happening. He asked Sundar to meet him in person, to talk, to plan. Jaishankar's voice carried a weight of experience, the tone of a man who had faced storms and walked out stronger. Sundar felt a strange relief. He was no longer alone in this, but relief was mixed with fear. If Washington was already pushing and India was already preparing, then the storm had already begun. That night, Sundar could not sleep. He walked around his house, the soft sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. He thought of his parents, his children, his responsibilities, his values. Every thought was tied to one question. How does one choose between silence and courage? Silence could protect him, could keep his company safe, but courage could protect something much bigger, the dignity of millions who looked to leaders for strength, even when those leaders came from unexpected places. The following week brought more pressure. Washington sent documents, suggestions, even veiled threats. They wanted India to comply on matters that went beyond trade, beyond policy. It was about pride, about bending to power. Sundar's role was clear in their eyes. He, was to use his influence, his voice, to convince India that resistance was useless. But every time Sundar looked at the papers, every time he read the demands, something inside him refused to accept it. Days later, he sat across from Jaishankar in a quiet room in New Delhi. The foreign minister's eyes were sharp yet kind, his manner calm but firm. "They want to use you, Sundar," Jaishankar said softly. "They believe you are the bridge between Silicon Valley and India, and that if you bend, we will bend." Sundar lowered his eyes, feeling the truth of those words strike deep. Jaishankar leaned forward, his voice steady. "But what they do not understand is that humility is not surrender, and respect is not weakness. You carry India with you, Sundar, even when you are far from home. And if you stand tall, then so will we." Sundar listened, his heart heavy yet strangely uplifted. In that moment he realized this was not about politics alone, it was about identity, about resilience, about choosing to live by the values that had shaped him since childhood. But he also knew the road ahead would not be easy. Washington was not known to back down without a fight, and the demands would only grow sharper, the threats more dangerous. As the meeting ended, Jaishankar placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder. "Prepare yourself," he said quietly. "What comes next will test not only your mind, but your spirit." Later that night, as Sundar sat alone in his hotel room, a new message appeared on his phone. It was short, only a few lines, but it froze him where he sat. It was not from Washington this time. It was from someone inside Silicon Valley, someone close to him. The message was clear. If Sundar did not comply with Washington's demands, secrets from his company would be exposed. Secrets that could shake his reputation and his legacy. Sundar dropped the phone on the bed, his hands trembling. The storm was no longer distant. It had reached his doorstep, and it was more dangerous than he had imagined. And so part one ends not with answers, but with the weight of impossible choices pressing down on Sundar. He could protect his company, his image, his comfort, or he could step into the fire, knowing that kindness and resilience might be his only shield. The night outside was silent, but inside, his heart was filled with the sound of a storm that was only beginning. A voice of calm in chaos. The hours after Sundar read, the threatening message felt endless. He sat on the edge of his hotel bed in New Delhi, staring at the dim glow of the phone screen as though it might explain itself. The words repeated in his mind like a haunting echo. "If you do not comply, we will expose everything." But what was everything? Sundar knew that every company had secrets, not malicious but sensitive details that, if twisted in the wrong hands, could paint shadows where there was none. He thought of the engineers working day and night, the dreams of young students who looked up to him, and the fragile trust people placed in technology. One leak, one smear, and that trust could collapse like glass shattering on stone. The night bled into morning, and the sounds of the city slowly rose outside his window. The horns of cars, the shouts of vendors, the rhythm of life pulsing through the streets of Delhi. Sundar felt strangely disconnected, as though he were inside a sealed room, watching the world move without him. But then came the knock at his door. Steady, calm, almost reassuring. When he opened it, Jaishankar stood there, his presence filling the space not with noise but with an unshakable calm. They sat together at a small table, the morning light filtering through half-closed curtains. Jaishankar listened as Sundar explained the threat, his voice steady but carrying the weight of fear. The foreign minister did not interrupt, did not rush him. Instead, he let Sundar speak until the words ran out, until silence fell heavy in the room. Only then did he lean back, his fingers gently tapping the wooden table. "Sundar," Jaishankar said softly, "do you know why they chose you?" Sundar shook his head, though the answer already pulsed in his heart. Jaishankar continued, his tone thoughtful but edged with quiet strength. "They believe that your success is their tool. They think that because you lead a company that touches billions, you must also carry the power to bend your homeland. But what they do not understand is that power does not only lie in money, or in threats, or in influence. True power lies in character, and character cannot be forced. The words settled deep in Sundar's chest, both comforting and terrifying. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that character was enough. But the memory of the threat still burned, and the shadow of Washington's pressure loomed large. As the day went on, meetings were arranged, discussions began behind closed doors, and the weight on Sundar only grew heavier. Officials whispered about Washington's intentions, about the possibility of sanctions, about how far the president's circle might go to get their way. Every conversation carried an edge of fear, but also an undercurrent of pride. India had faced storms before. This was not the first, and it would not be the last. Yet never before had someone like Sundar, a man from the quiet streets of Chennai, been placed at the heart of it. That evening, Sundar walked alone through the crowded streets near Connaught Place. The city was alive. Families laughing over meals, shopkeepers calling out to customers, children chasing each other across narrow lanes. For a moment, Sundar felt the world shrink to these simple sights. He remembered being a boy in India, riding crowded trains, hearing the rhythm of a country that never slept. He thought of his father saving for years so he could study abroad, of the sacrifices that had built the foundation of his life. These memories steadied him. They reminded him that humility was not weakness. It was a strength that grew roots in hardship and bloomed in patience. Yet just as calm began to return, another shadow appeared. When Sundar returned to his hotel, a sealed envelope awaited him at the front desk. No sender's name, no markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "We know who you are meeting. Do not test us." The paper trembled in his hand. This was no longer distant diplomacy. It was intrusion, surveillance, a reminder that eyes were watching every step. Sundar felt his chest tighten, fear clawing at his resolve. Who could he trust? Even in Silicon Valley, allies could become enemies. And here, in the heart of Delhi, the line between friend and foe blurred with every passing hour. Later that night, he met Jaishankar again. He handed him the note, his face pale. The minister studied it carefully, then folded it without expression. "This is how pressure works," he said calmly. "They will make you doubt yourself, doubt your allies, doubt even your own courage. But remember, Sundar, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to walk forward in spite of it." Jaishankar's words were steady, but Sundar noticed something else in his eyes. A flicker of weariness, a trace of the heavy burden he too carried. For years, Jaishankar had stood at the front lines of diplomacy, facing storms of arrogance, manipulation, and power plays. Yet his calm never broke. Sundar wondered how a man could carry so much weight and still stand tall. As midnight approached, Jaishankar shared something unexpected. "When I was a young diplomat," he began slowly, "I once faced a negotiation where the other side threatened everything. Our trade, our security, even our dignity. I was afraid. I thought we could not stand. But then I realized, dignity is not theirs to give or take. It is ours to keep. Once you understand that, fear loses its grip." The room was quiet after his words, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. Sundar sat still, his heart absorbing the lesson like dry earth drinking rain. Yet even as hope flickered, he knew the storm was far from over. Washington would not stop. The threats would escalate. And now, with shadows following his every move, the danger felt closer than ever. When Jaishankar left, Sundar remained alone in the room, staring at the city lights outside the window. He wanted to believe in strength, in resilience, in dignity. But in the quiet of the night, doubt returned. He wondered if kindness could really withstand cruelty, if humility could really defeat arrogance. Then his phone buzzed once more. This time it was not Washington, not Silicon Valley, not even a diplomat. It was a personal message, from an unknown number, written in broken words that carried the weight of threat and betrayal. "Someone close to you is not what they seem. Beware before you trust." Sundar froze, his heart pounding. The storm had taken a darker turn. It was no longer just about nations, it was personal. Someone close to him, maybe inside his company, maybe inside his circle, was working against him. And if that was true, then the fight was no longer only about India. It was about survival. Lines in the sand, the message that warned Sundar of betrayal, did not leave his mind. Even as he tried to focus on meetings and diplomatic briefings, the words kept circling like vultures above him. Someone close to you is not what they seem. The thought spread through his chest like a slow poison. Trust, once shaken, does not heal easily. Sundar found himself questioning every conversation, every glance, every word spoken by those around him. He had built his entire career on trust in his teams, in his mentors, in his principles, and now that very foundation felt fragile. In those heavy hours, Sundar's mind drifted back to his childhood in Chennai. The small two-room house where he grew up had thin walls and limited space, but it was filled with dignity. His father worked tirelessly, often coming home with soot on his clothes, his hands rough from labor. His mother managed the home with quiet grace, making small sacrifices invisible to a child's eyes. Sundar remembered nights when electricity would cut out, and the family would sit together by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. In those moments, he learned something simple but powerful. Life does not always give you control, but you can always choose your response. Resilience was born not from wealth but from the way his parents carried hardship with calm and kindness. That memory gave him strength now, as he stood at the center of a storm larger than anything he had faced before. Washington's demands were no longer just words. They had sharpened into threats. Officials spoke openly of cutting funding, of spreading damaging rumors, of isolating India in the global stage. Behind closed doors, Trump's circle spoke of India as though it were a pawn, a piece to be moved on a chessboard where only one side was meant to win. Jaishankar, steady as always, met these pressures with a calm refusal to bow. His words in meetings were precise, respectful, yet unyielding. He spoke of partnership, not submission, of dignity, not obedience. Sundar admired this, but he also saw how each refusal added to the weight of threats that followed. The circle around Trump grew sharper, more desperate to prove that power could bend anyone. Then came the moment that shook Sundar's fragile sense of security. During a private strategy session in Delhi, a report was placed on the table in front of him. It contained transcripts of conversations, emails, internal discussions, even snippets of phone calls. And among those names and messages was one that made Sundar's blood run cold. It was a person he had trusted deeply in Silicon Valley, someone who had walked with him through years of building, someone he considered a loyal ally. The words in the report left no doubt. This person had been passing information to Washington, feeding them details, painting Sundar as hesitant and vulnerable. The betrayal hit him harder than any threat from outside. It was not just information that had been shared. It was trust that had been broken, trust that could never be repaired. Sundar sat in silence for a long time, staring at the pages, feeling the sharp sting of realization. Betrayal does not shout. It whispers quietly until you finally hear its voice, and by then, it is too late. Jaishankar noticed the change in Sundar's face. He leaned forward, his voice steady but grave. "You see now," he said. "The battle is not only outside. Sometimes the harshest battles are fought in the shadows of those we trust." Sundar closed the file slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a surge of anger rise inside him, but it was not the kind of anger that explodes in noise. It was quiet, heavy, the kind that settles deep in the chest and waits for the right moment to strike. Over the following days, the tension deepened. Washington's representatives began arriving with louder voices and sharper words. One official, in a heated exchange, even slammed his fist on the table, declaring, "If India does not step aside, we will make sure the world sees who truly holds the strings." The arrogance was raw, the disrespect almost suffocating. Sundar, who sat quietly in the corner of the room, felt every word pierce his heart. Not because he feared the threats, but because he realized how far some people would go to reduce dignity into a bargaining chip. And yet, through it all, Jaishankar remained calm. His responses were deliberate, his tone never rising. his words carefully chosen. He embodied a truth Sundar had learned long ago. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to bend, the stillness that outlasts the storm. But, even as the minister projected calm, Sundar's personal world was unraveling. Back in Silicon Valley, whispers had begun to circulate. Anonymous leaks suggested that Sundar was entangled in political games, that he was acting not as a CEO, but as a political agent. The media hinted at conflicts of interest, painting him as divided between his homeland and his adopted nation. Sundar knew the source of those whispers. Betrayal had a face now, even if he could not yet confront it directly. One evening, as the city outside grew quiet and the moonlight spilled across the streets, Sundar sat alone with Jaishankar. He confessed his fear, not of Washington, not of sanctions, but of losing himself. "What if they destroy everything I have built?" he asked, his voice low, almost breaking. Jaishankar studied him carefully before answering. "Sundar, what you have built is not only in offices or in headlines. What you have built lives in the trust of people, in the respect you have earned, in the values you carry. They cannot destroy that. They can try to smear it, but they cannot take it away." The words gave Sundar a flicker of hope. But the storm was far from done. The very next day he received another message. This time it was not a warning, not a veiled threat. It was a direct order from Washington. The demand was simple yet humiliating. Sundar was to make a public statement, urging India to comply with the president's demands. Failure to do so, the message warned, would unleash consequences both for him and for India's global standing. The paper shook in his hands as he read it. His chest tightened, his breath slowed. Here was the line in the sand. Silence was no longer an option. To speak would be to betray his homeland. To stay silent would be to risk everything he had built. He folded the paper slowly, placed it on the table before Jaishankar and whispered, "What do we do now?" The minister looked at him with steady eyes, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he spoke in a low voice. "We prepare, Sundar, because once you cross this line, nothing will ever be the same." And in that moment, Sundar knew the storm was about to break open. The choices ahead would not only shape his life, but ripple through nations, through millions, through history itself. Breaking point, the demand from Washington sat on the table like a silent weapon. Sundar could not look at it without feeling. The sharp edge cut into his chest. A public statement, humiliating and forced, crafted not with respect but with arrogance. It was not just about politics anymore. It was about breaking India's spirit, and breaking his own identity in the process. The words seemed to echo in his head long after he had folded the paper, as though they were carved into his memory. Days turned into a blur. He walked through meetings, sat in conference halls, and nodded at briefings, but his mind was never fully present. The weight of expectation pressed down like iron chains. He thought of the engineers in California, of the millions of users who trusted him as a leader, of his parents back home who had raised him with quiet dignity. And each time he wondered, was he strong enough to carry both his personal world and the weight of a nation's pride? The storm outside grew louder. Newspapers began speculating openly about Sundar's role in the standoff. Some painted him as a secret diplomat. Others accused him of betrayal to one side or the other. His name, once synonymous with innovation and calm leadership, was now entangled with headlines about global conflict. He read those headlines in silence, his heart heavy, the betrayal in Silicon Valley still burning fresh in his mind. Yet in the midst of this chaos, Jaishankar remained a pillar of calm. Each evening, the foreign minister would sit with Sundar, often in dimly lit rooms where the hum of air conditioners was the only background noise. He would speak softly, not of strategy alone, but of resilience, of the long history of India's struggles and victories, of the countless times dignity had been tested but never destroyed. Sundar found himself listening not only with his mind but with his heart. In Jaishankar's calm presence, he found a reminder of what true strength looked like. It was not loud, not aggressive, but steady, unshakable. like a mountain that refused to move. But Sundar's personal world continued to unravel. Back in California, the betrayal deepened. Confidential memos were being leaked to the press, twisted into narratives that painted Sundar as weak and indecisive. Colleagues who had once stood close now began to step back, their eyes filled with suspicion. Sundar walked through the Google campus one morning during a brief return, and for the first time in years he felt like a stranger in his own home. Whispers followed him. Questions hung in the air, and trust, the invisible thread that had always held his teams together, seemed to be fraying. He sat in his office late one night, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass windows, and felt the crushing solitude of leadership. Every choice seemed to come with unbearable cost. If he complied with Washington, he would betray his roots and shame the very values that had carried him through life. If he refused, he risked losing not only his career, but also the fragile stability of the company he had spent years building. It was a choice with no safe path, a choice that would mark him forever. Then came the moment that shattered the silence. A direct message arrived, not from advisors, not from envoys, not from hidden allies. It was from Trump himself. The words were sharp, unfiltered, heavy with threat. The president demanded immediate cooperation, making it clear that failure to obey would unleash a storm of consequences. Sanctions, investigations, personal attacks. Everything was on the table. "You will make the statement," the message declared, "or you will face what comes next." Sundar sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the screen. It was one thing to hear threats through layers of advisors, another to face them directly from the most powerful office in the world. The final veil had been removed. This was no longer pressure from a distance. It was a direct ultimatum, one that left no space for compromise. The following days blurred into a haze of tension. Jaishankar's team scrambled to prepare responses. Diplomats worked late into the night, and allies whispered in cautious tones. Some urged compliance, others urged defiance, but all agreed on one truth. The world was watching. And in the middle of it all, Sundar felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with the ground crumbling beneath his feet. The pressure took its toll. Sundar found himself unable to sleep, pacing his rooms until dawn, haunted by the echo of Trump's words. He thought of his children, of the life he had built so carefully, of the trust placed in him by millions who would never know the full weight of what he carried. He thought of his father's hands, rough and scarred from years of work, and wondered if he was honoring the sacrifices made for him. One night, in a rare moment of weakness, Sundar confessed to Jaishankar that he felt close to breaking. "I do not know if I can carry this any longer," he whispered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Every path feels like a loss. Every step feels like betrayal." Jaishankar listened quietly, his eyes steady. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but unyielding. "Sundar, breaking does not mean you are weak. Even the strongest glass will shatter under enough weight. But remember, strength is not in never breaking. It is in what you choose after. You are not alone in this. India stands with you. I stand with you." Those words steadied Sundar, if only for a moment. He realized that even in the storm, even with betrayal around him and threats pressing down, he was not entirely alone. There was still dignity to protect, still kindness to hold on to, still resilience to carry forward. But just as hope began to flicker, another blow struck. A confidential file was leaked to the press, one that contained sensitive discussions between Sundar and Jaishankar. The headlines screamed betrayal, painting Sundar as a puppet of India, accusing him of double loyalty, questioning his integrity. The world's eyes turned sharper, suspicion grew louder, and the pressure reached a breaking point. Sundar held the newspaper in his trembling hands, his heart pounding with rage and fear. Someone close to him had crossed the final line. The betrayal was no longer hidden in whispers. It was out in the open, tearing at his name, his legacy, his very identity. He looked at Jaishankar with eyes filled with both despair and determination. "They want to break me," he said quietly, "but I will not let them." Jaishankar nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Then you must be ready, Sundar, because now the storm has no mask. It will come with its full force. And when it does, you must decide who you truly are. And just as he spoke, a new message arrived on Sundar's phone. It was short, brutal, and final. The president will address you directly tomorrow. Your choice will decide everything. Sundar stared at the screen, his chest tight, his breath shallow. Tomorrow. The breaking point. The comeback, the night before the president's address, was the longest of Sundar's life. He sat in silence, the dim glow of his phone the only light in the room, replaying every word, every threat, every betrayal in his mind. Outside, the city of Delhi pulsed with its usual rhythm, traffic horns, street vendors shouting, the murmur of life in a restless capital. But for Sundar, the world had narrowed into a suffocating silence. He thought of the ultimatum waiting at dawn. Tomorrow, Trump would speak to him directly, and whatever choice he made would echo not only across his own life but across nations. Sleep did not come. Instead, memories returned. Memories of a small boy in Chennai waiting patiently for his father to return from work. The faint glow of a kerosene lamp lighting his school books. The quiet evenings when his mother reminded him that dignity was never for sale no matter how hard life became. These were not just memories. They were lessons, etched into his bones. Humility was his strength. Respect was his guide. Resilience was his inheritance. Now standing at the edge of history, he had to decide whether those values could survive the storm. The morning came heavy with tension. A call was arranged. Sundar sat in a secure room in New Delhi, with Jaishankar beside him. The screens flickered, and then the president appeared. Sharp suit, fierce eyes, a presence that filled the room even from across the ocean. His voice was blunt, forceful, cutting through the air like a hammer striking steel. "Mr. Pichai," he began, "this is your last chance. You will make the statement. You will show the world that India stands with us. If you refuse, the consequences will be on your head." Every word was heavy with arrogance, every pause filled with the certainty of power. Sundar listened quietly, his face calm, though his chest tightened with each passing moment. He glanced at Jaishankar, who sat still, his hands folded, his eyes sharp yet serene. The foreign minister did not flinch, did not blink. His presence was a steady flame in the storm. When the president finished, silence filled the room. Sundar's throat felt dry. The weight of expectation pressed hard against him, but before he could speak, Jaishankar leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. President," he said, "you speak of consequences, but you forget something important. Dignity is not something you can order. Respect cannot be demanded. If India stands, it is because we choose to, not because we are told to. And if you believe threats can bend us, then you do not know us at all." The words were simple, but they struck with the force of thunder. The president's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. The air in the room grew heavier, the silence sharper. Sundar felt his heart pound as he watched the moment unfold. Jaishankar had spoken not with anger, but with calm defiance, a defiance rooted in respect, in history, in unshakable dignity. The president's reply came fast, his tone sharper, louder, filled with frustration. He spoke of sanctions, of isolation, of breaking partnerships. He painted pictures of collapse, of loss, of ruin. But with each word, Jaishankar's calm seemed only to grow stronger. Sundar, sitting beside him, felt something shift inside. For the first time in days, the fear that had pressed so heavily on his chest began to ease. He realized that kindness was not weakness, humility was not surrender. They were shields stronger than arrogance, walls that could not be broken by threats. After the call ended, the room fell silent once more. Sundar leaned back in his chair, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his heart carried a strange new strength. He turned to Jaishankar, who remained calm, his expression unreadable. "You spoke as if the whole world was listening," Sundar whispered. Jaishankar's eyes met his. "Perhaps they were," he replied. In the hours that followed, news spread, quickly. Whispers of the confrontation reached diplomats, journalists, and boardrooms across continents. Some dismissed India's defiance as reckless. Others watched with a mixture of shock and respect. For the first time, it was not Washington's threats making headlines. It was India's refusal to bow. But Sundar's battle was not yet won. Back in Silicon Valley, the betrayal within his circle continued to stir chaos. Leaked stories now claimed that Sundar had personally insulted the president, that he was endangering global relations for personal pride. Colleagues hesitated to stand beside him. Allies kept their distance. He felt the isolation deepening, but now instead of despair, he felt a quiet resolve building. He had seen what courage looked like. He had heard it in Jaishankar's voice. And he knew he could not allow betrayal or fear to silence him any longer. That evening, Sundar made a decision that startled even those closest to him. He called a meeting with his leadership team at Google, and in a calm voice he told them the truth. Not the twisted headlines, not the rumors. The truth of what was happening, of the pressure he faced, of the choices before him. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, something remarkable happened. The room grew silent, eyes softened, and the distance he had felt began to close. Some nodded slowly, others wiped tears, but all understood one thing. Their leader was not hiding. He was standing in the storm with honesty, humility, and resilience. That night, as Sundar returned to his room, he found a new message waiting. This time, it was not a threat. It was a warning from a quiet ally within Silicon Valley. The betrayal is closer than you think. The next strike will come tomorrow. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. Tomorrow. Another blow was waiting, one that could undo everything, one that might shatter even the fragile comeback he had begun to build. He sat in silence, the words glowing on his phone like fire in the dark. He knew now that the storm was not finished. Tomorrow the fight would reach its fiercest point. And in that moment, standing at the edge of exhaustion and defiance, Sundar realized one truth. The comeback was not about winning. It was about refusing to break no matter the cost. The world changes. The night was heavy with silence, but inside Sundar's chest, a storm raged. The message from his ally echoed in his mind. The betrayal is closer than you think. The next strike will come tomorrow. Every word carried the chill of certainty. Sundar had been warned before, but this time felt different. It was not only about leaked documents or whispered rumors. This time, the strike promised to be final, designed to break him completely. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the stillness. His thoughts drifted back to his journey. The crowded trains of Chennai, the evenings by the kerosene lamp, the sacrifices of his parents, the long path that led him across oceans to Silicon Valley. He remembered the first time he walked into Google, a quiet young man among giants, never imagining he would one day lead them. Humility had carried him, resilience had shaped him, kindness had defined him. And now, those same values were being tested against the sharpest weapons of arrogance and fear. When morning came, it arrived not with peace but with fire. Newspapers blazed with headlines accusing Sundar of treason, claiming he was secretly working with India to undermine Washington. Commentators shouted on screens, analysts questioned his loyalty, and investors whispered of collapse. Someone had unleashed the strike, just as the warning promised. The betrayal had become a flood, pouring into every corner of his life. In Silicon Valley, panic spread through his company. Board members called urgent meetings, demanding explanations. Colleagues who had stood close now looked at him with doubt in their eyes. For a moment, Sundar felt the weight of isolation return, heavier than before, pressing so hard he could hardly breathe. But then came the call. Jaishankar's voice cut through the noise like a steady flame. Sundar, he said, today they will push harder than ever. Today they believe they can break you. But listen carefully. Today is not about them. Today is about us. Today is about showing the world what dignity looks like when it refuses to bow. The words steadied him. Sundar felt the storm inside settle, if only slightly. He knew what he had to do. Later that day, Sundar walked into a press conference in New Delhi. The room was packed with reporters from around the world, cameras flashing, eyes sharp with suspicion. Whispers filled the air, each one carrying doubt, accusation, curiosity. Sundar stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his heart steady despite the storm. He did not speak of politics, he did not speak of power. Instead, he spoke of values. He told the story of a boy growing up in India, of parents who taught him that respect mattered more than wealth, that humility mattered more than pride, that resilience mattered more than comfort. He spoke of his journey, of the countless people who had walked with him, of the trust he carried not as a burden but as a gift. Respect, he said softly, his voice carrying through the hall, cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Humility is not weakness, it is strength that survives when arrogance fails. And resilience is not about avoiding storms. It is about standing when the storm tries to break you. The room fell silent. Reporters who had come searching for scandal now leaned forward, their pen still, their cameras steady. Sundar's voice was not loud, but it carried a weight far greater than noise. Then, as the world listened, Jaishankar stepped forward. His presence filled the room with quiet power. India will not bend, he said firmly. We respect every nation, but we will not be ordered. We believe in partnership, not submission. And we believe that dignity is not negotiable. This is our stand, and it will not change. The shock was immediate. The press conference rippled across the world within minutes. Headlines shifted. Commentators who had predicted India's collapse now found themselves stunned by its defiance. Leaders in distant capitals whispered in disbelief. For the first time in years, the arrogance of power had been met not with fear, but with calm resistance rooted in dignity. In Washington, the response was furious. Threats doubled, accusations sharpened, and the air grew heavier with the possibility of open confrontation. But something had already changed. The world was watching and the world was listening. Nations that had once remained silent began to speak. Allies who had once bowed quietly began to rise. Respect was spreading, carried not by force but by example. For Sundar, the days that followed were both the hardest and the most defining of his life. In Silicon Valley, the betrayal was finally revealed. The name of the insider who had fed information to Washington came into the light. It was someone Sundar had once called a friend, someone he had trusted completely. The revelation cut deep, but strangely it did not break him. By then he had learned that betrayal cannot erase values, that lies cannot destroy dignity. Instead of anger, Sundar chose something unexpected. He did not retaliate. He did not humiliate the betrayer. He simply stepped forward with honesty, acknowledging the betrayal but refusing to let it define him. Trust, he told his team, is fragile, but kindness does not depend on it. We will continue with respect, no matter what has been done to us. Those words, simple and steady, began to rebuild what betrayal had torn apart. Colleagues who had doubted him now saw the truth. Trust slowly returned, not because Sundar demanded it, but because he earned it again, through resilience, through humility, through kindness.